no issues?
No issues there.
There. Okay.
There. Is that where you can see it? Because I'm okay if you slide that over, because there's no use that being near me. No offense.
I am offended.
Yeah. Well, you're mighty easily offended this morning, Justin.
I'm offended every time you use the term "no offense." So.
Is that what offends you itself?
Yes.
Yeah.
It in of itself is
Understood.
It's my trigger.
So here's the bait for the morning, Justin. How are you?
I'm dandy.
Nice. Well done. I'm glad you're dandy.
Besides being dandy, I'm a little sleepy.
Oh yeah.
But wow.
But
Can't get that word. But good. Dandy.
I'm glad to hear you're dandy.
Yeah. How are you?
I am well. I'm
Good.
excited for the day. It's just I think these springier days have that tendency.
Give you a little spring in your step.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Same.
Yep.
Yes. Oh, there's
We're keeping Justin up. He's ready to go back to bed.
I'm sure I could. I could. Unlike you, Mark.
I know. Once I'm up, man, I tell you, I'm ready to go. Yeah.
I'm usually that way.
Yeah, I would. Yeah. Welcome to How I See It with me, Mark Pratt, and
Justin Sternberg. This is a podcast that works to counter cultural polarization through thoughtful conversations. So, today, we're going to cover a pretty polarizing subject.
Yeah.
I think it gets even more polarizing when you get into the evangelical or, the kind of, Christian perspective, right?
Sure.
And that subject is divorce.
Yeah.
So, when I say divorce, what's the first thing that comes to mind?
Honestly, for me, I had a mentor, a close friend, and his son. Actually, it was a couple that separated. That basically, I think I mentioned them in the when I talked about one of the podcasts back about holy discontent. There was a couple that separated.
Yep.
This man that was my mentor, his son was the individual getting divorced. And we really got into, in hindsight, it wasn't necessarily it was too close to both of us to really discuss, what was going on well.
Yeah.
Because it was just too personal. It was too raw.
Yeah.
And I remember when you mentioned divorce, that's really what comes to mind for me, was that conversation and that interaction with him. Because we had moved to North Carolina, and I made the mistake of sending him a letter with my thoughts in it. And that just wasn't the right thing to do. And, and we got back together, and he shared his thoughts with me in a face-to-face confrontation, which was far more, mature on his part. But yeah, I just remember, it taught me a lot.
Yeah.
Because I think we can recognize that what it taught me was I was able to recognize I'm not in this. I'm not going through this. So for me to just kind of step back to the side or sit back and just kind of judge from my vantage point wasn't beneficial. And, and I think we can have that, like so many things, it's like, I can judge it from a distance, but when it's the people near me, it's when it's my marriage, when it's, my, significant friend or family member. I think that's a helpful thing when we're able to recognize how personal that dynamic is, because I do believe no one desires to get divorced from the altar. People don't get married in order to be divorced,
or else they wouldn't do that thing called vows.
Yeah. So I'm sorry.
Yeah.
That's a long
No,
question,
it's good.
long answer to your question, but that's what comes to
Yeah.
mind.
You
What
made me,
about you?
well, you made me think about, because you're basically talking about when you can't be objective, you're naturally subjective,
Sure.
right? To a subject. And it kind of makes me think of those vision tests where it's like, if you're, what is it, farsighted, if something's too close to you, it's not in focus.
Sure.
Right?
No,
It's
I hear you.
blurry, and so you kind of have to move it further away before it kind of comes into focus.
Yeah.
Or and vice versa, if you're nearsighted, like it needs to be pretty close for you to be able to focus on it. And any further, it starts to.
Sure.
And I feel like there's some, it's a pretty good analogy for requiring objective eyes to be able to speak into a subject for that focus, right? For
Yeah.
that clarity. And sometimes we're just too darn close. I need to pull it back, or
Yeah.
I just have to recognize I don't have the required level of objectivity to speak into a thing.
Yeah.
And that's something I've hard learned as well, Mark.
I hear.
Like speaking into things I had no business doing because I was too close, and so my vision of it is like, oh, that's got to be an E and an F and a 2. It's
Right.
like, oh no, actually it was an A and a B.
Yeah.
And there's been many times that exactly that situation happened where it's like I had it all summed up, and based on the blurry version I saw, I was pretty sure it was this.
Yeah.
Spoke into it, and it was like, yeah, I kind of missed the mark. I don't know if that's what the kind of thing yours
Yeah.
was,
It's to the point of being able to recognize that when I am looking at something, not to use the near and far, but when I'm looking at something from a distance, I can have it pretty well figured out.
yeah.
But when I go in, when I'm actually in the box, if you will, or when I interact with those people, it's like, okay, yeah, this is different than I thought it was. Because, and I think even scripturally, when the Pharisees addressed divorce with Jesus, and he was able, and Jesus, shared, it's because of your hardness of your heart. That's what Jesus shared from my perspective scripturally, as they're defining divorce. I recognize there's a lot of hurt that goes with that hardening. It's not that people just choose, and I think Jesus understood this.
Yeah.
We see his compassion for the Samaritan woman, the woman at the well who had been married 5 times, and yet at the same time, and the guy she was currently living with is not her husband. So, she had experienced that rejection, that divorce 5 times, and got to the point where she was basically recognizing, okay, I'm just not good at this. I'm going to give up. And yeah, I need a guy around, but at the same time, and what I see in that, if I may, from our perspective, is I see that Jesus understood that hardness of heart that comes, with hurts in relationship, but yet, unlike us, there's not a condemnation
Right.
necessarily in that. And I think, when God talks about the fact that, basically the children of Israel divorced him, they turned their backs on him. So I take that from an aspect that says, okay, God completely understands what couples who are going through divorce feel like, and he has compassion for them. He doesn't necessarily desire that, he doesn't necessarily, but yeah, it's not a condemnation. And I think so often even just bringing up that topic, it's like, well, we almost need a divorced person in the room,
Yeah.
to speak to that. But yeah,
Yeah.
that's kind of where I come back to is, God understands that. And sometimes from our married vantage point, it's easy to say, well, this, and this. And when we get into that level of, oh, okay, yeah, I didn't see it that way, and recognize, that no one chooses that, that's where it becomes,
Yeah.
that aspect of the polarizing dynamics come a little more into balance. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Absolutely. I think, Yeah, I think part of the reason it's good to talk about it, even from our perspective, is because I think it's important to basically come to a place of compassion that you said
Sure.
that aligns with God's level of compassion as people who, are happily married and trying to consult with or help those who are considering divorce. I think sometimes, especially in the Christian world, it can be like, well, that's the nuclear option and you should never choose it,
Yeah.
And man, that's a hard one to figure out, and that's why it's polarizing, is like I said, especially in
Yeah.
the Christian community, because we're pretty clear on what God's word says about it, right?
Yeah.
And yet I read this pretty good article yesterday by a friend of a friend, basically, and they discussed some issues in their previous marriage where there was some abuse, abuse verbally, and abuse, some different levels of abuse, and on top of it, some hidden addiction and different things
Sure.
like that, and not providing for the family, different things like there's just a pretty significant list of things, and it was a little bit sad to me to hear her have to try and like go to court. Like, here's my reasons that I needed to do this.
Sure.
And
Defending herself.
defend herself, yeah. And when she's was already spending years and years defending herself against her own husband, that kind of thing. And then, like you said, the Bible says, therefore, there is no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. And when he approached that woman at the well, the purpose of him calling out, all of her past marriage indiscretions was to make a very clear point to her that what you're seeking is empty.
Sure.
What you're seeking is not filling your thirst.
Sure.
There wasn't condemnation in that, you know? And if you ever get a chance to watch The Chosen,
Oh, yeah.
I think the very last episode of the first season, it is that scene.
Sure.
And, it's very much aligns with the biblical story.
Yeah.
But just to kind of see the way their expressions play out, like, it's just beautiful to see how there wasn't condemnation in Jesus' words, but instead freedom.
Yeah. Spirit and truth.
Spirit and truth, yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
To be able to recognize that, there isn't that condemnation, but yet, and Jesus desires to minister to our hearts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
First and foremost, I guess I would say, in some ways, I think that's the holy of holies in some ways, in our body is our heart. And, to be able to recognize that, God cares about the heart, and those who follow him, their hearts are transformed by his presence. So I still want to bring that back to the whole divorce. And I'm sorry, like I say, that it's interesting because I think what you bring up about what happens in marriage, in the process of, I think sometimes we want to kind of smooth over all that. And I think, so often it does come down to us being able to walk with that individual, just like Jesus did, and say, it's not that, and I think that's what I learned from that letter. When I wrote that letter, it was a blanket statement that said, all divorce is because of this hardness of heart. You follow me? And I didn't have the compassion for individuals at that point who are experiencing, addiction in relationship, abuse in relationship, because I do believe, marriage, as I would see it, or as I believe God sees it, marriage is, it's an opportunity for use, but not abuse. Mm. So my body doesn't necessarily belong to me. It belongs to my spouse when we enter into marriage, and vice versa.
We become one.
Yeah. And so therefore I do, it's like I believe there are boundaries.
Yes.
I believe there has to be boundaries to be able to say, okay, this is too far, and we need, and I routinely work with, individuals who even may need to separate And I have no issue with separation, in a way that is able to repair or reunify in some ways, as we deal with our own individual behaviors, to be able to come back. But I also recognize that that's not going to necessarily work with every couple.
Yeah.
And my heart, goes out to those couples. And even this lady, who's basically having to defend herself, because I think, that becomes what was her role? What was in the church?
She's a worship leader.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yep. And, her story's pretty significant in that there's more than that in her life. She struggled with various kinds of sexual abuse from different leaders in the church and things like that.
Sure.
So there's certainly a pattern there that I think, tied into the fact that I'm supposed to play this role, of a submissive person, whatever that is. And I think, it's just a really sad situation. And it's like you read that and go, no, you're not supposed to, get out, whatever. But there's this balance, right? So obviously marriage in terms of covenant is higher than like a job, right? Because you literally stand before each other and you vow, and that God says a lot about vows. And so I think we're supposed to take them very seriously. And we do,
Sure.
in marriage generally. But I think about it like in a job, very often immature people will say this job sucks and I want out. And they'll explain all the reasons why. And if they're able to consult with someone who's had some years, in the job world or whatever, has a little bit of wisdom, some experience under their belt, they're able to say, you know what? Some of this is true, but some of this is you.
Sure.
And jobs are hard, and perseverance is very important in career, right? Like learning how to be diligent, learning how to persevere through difficult circumstances, learning the tools required to address conflict. Like there's just so many important things that you have to learn early on in your career to establish being able to be a good employee, and that being said, there are caustic job environments, right? Where it's like, no, you shouldn't stay in that.
Sure.
And determining where that line is very difficult. And yet we don't then, when someone leaves a job, go, I'm pretty sure you sinned hard. That's a big no-no in the big book. You left that job, where divorce, obviously there's some significant, verbiage in the Bible that can make it very condemning. And I think that's the thing that's so obviously so polarizing is as Christians who want to counsel others, it's not like a job where like, well, you need to stick it out, you need to persevere until a certain point, and then it's like, okay, and then maybe it's time to look for a new job, and that's okay. You can't say that, right? Yeah. It's like, have you ever said that, Mark? Like, you need to stick it out, persevere, do your best, do this, but if it doesn't work out, it's okay. You just find another one.
Another job.
Another spouse.
Another spouse. Yeah, I've never said that.
I'm saying, I doubt that's ever come up in Mark's marriage counseling. Although, maybe tomorrow. We
think we've seen it all, but maybe not quite. Yes, right. I hear you.
But you know what I'm saying? Like it's, I feel like the job thing is a good correlation in terms of you don't just counsel someone to leave a job,
I hear you.
Typically.
Yeah.
But if you know a person well and you know what they're capable of and their work ethic, you know them pretty well, you know what they've been through, the other jobs they've stuck out, whatever. It's much easier to consult them to say, yeah, this looks like a no-win situation.
Sure.
And one that's not healthy for you.
Yeah.
And it's easy to consult them to, you probably should look for another job, and it's just so natural and easy to advise someone in that situation. However, in that same situation in marriage, all those same things being true, I understand this person, I understand their perseverance, I understand their work ethic, I understand their experience in their life and what they've worked through and those kinds of things. And I look at the situation, I say, yeah, it's probably unhealthy for you. It's probably not going to be a situation that can recover. And my advice would be to move on. Right?
Yeah. And it's interesting. And I recognize this is an analogy.
Yes.
So I think it's interesting from my perspective as you have that dialogue, if you will. It's always interesting to hear so in a job, you have an employee and then you have the job, the thing they do, the people they work for. So in your analogy, that would be like the husband and the wife, in my opinion.
Okay.
So it's like, typically I'll say, there's three sides to every story, because there's your truth, my truth, and
Mark's.
no, and the whole truth,
The real truth,
the real truth,
Yeah.
because you might have some,
truth.
yes, the true truth, because there's certain aspects that you will see that are true according to the third perspective, and I'll have some truth but what I'm going to share isn't all truth, just like what you're sharing isn't all truth. That's where the third side comes into play. And I think, in that dialogue that you share so often, it is that scriptural dynamic that comes to play, in Proverbs, where it talks about the first person to share their point of view seems right until the other person comes into play and questions them, and I think so often in that counseling, it's like, well, what about this? What about, well, how many times were you late? If somebody's getting on you,
right?
How many times did you not show up for work?
He yells at me every single day when I get to work. It's just
Yes.
every day is on my back.
It's so negative.
Are you on time? Yeah.
How many days did you miss last week?
Yeah.
That
Just the normal two. Just Monday and Tuesday, because I don't like those days.
And I think there are those dynamics that factor into relationship.
Yeah.
I'll call it the unhealthy behaviors that I bring with me to relationship. And I think some of those, I think they're all human dynamics, that everyone brings into relationship. And yet, and that's where I think where you were coming from, I married the quote unquote wrong person. So often it's as much what I contribute, to that dissatisfaction, if I may, as what the other person does. And what I think in my mind, and I do believe, negative patterns develop quickly, or they can, based on what I look for. I think that's a large part of what can be, even when right now, even so many we're doing the Marriage on the Rock class. And, it saddens me sometimes when I think about how many people are in that class based on a second relationship, second marriage, second, and, and what they share, in that class is this aspect of, oh, I wish I had known this previously. And, when I'm hearing that person say that, it's like, oh, that's got a sting to be sitting next to that person, currently, and saying, man, I think if I'd known this, I could have maybe done something different with that previous relationship. And I sit with that, and when I hear that, and it's like, that's sad to me. Because that person is saying this might have made a difference. And I guess that's where part of my passion comes from, is a desire to communicate with people and help maintain current relationships so that they don't have to say, and granted, that's not to say that some, couples who, marry people who with addiction or, that kind of thing, I have nothing against them, but yet I'm also able to recognize that's not everybody's circumstance who went through divorce. And I like your line analogy because I believe there is a line because they're, healthy boundaries, and it's like, okay, is this something that we can relearn, when I'm putting up my right and my left hand as a healthy boundary type dynamic, because I believe my right hand is the ability to represent closeness. Okay. And my left hand is what represents individuality, independence. Mm-hmm. So I see healthy relationship as this ability to experience closeness, but yet we go to work and we can interact with other people in an independent manner that's healthy. But yet we still kind of we sway back and forth, in the process of a week through this experience of coming together in closeness and separating in independence or interdependence, that, we know where each other are at. We know what you're doing, that kind of thing. That's, but yet there's typically this opportunity to come back together, and yet not so far that my problems are your problems and your problems are my problems. We're not enmeshed, but yet we're able to be interdependent and help one another. Ooh, do you need me to fix that, or do you need me to just listen? Mm-hmm. Those kind of things. That's that closeness. But then on the other end, so I say all that in a process of being able to recognize that, from my perspective, divorce tends to go outside that boundary where I'm just going to go into isolation because that's the only option I have left. Or I'm going to lean towards this other person who understands me and meets these needs and accepts me just the way I am, because they're willing to accept my problems. My spouse isn't necessarily, they just say, well, you're making excuses.
Yeah.
But this other person. And so I recognize when we step outside of those boundaries, we are far more likely to head towards divorce just based on that isolation or, having quote unquote needs met outside of relationship. Mm-hmm. Because it's difficult. It's getting to a point where it's difficult to turn back to relationship. So turn back towards my spouse. So I tend to turn towards other things or other people. Yeah. Like you're saying, like you said with Jesus, that well, mm-hmm. that thirst. Mm-hmm. So sometimes I can recognize that, in my own life, my well might be striving. Mm-hmm. I work harder, but I need to recognize, no, 5 minutes with God in prayer can do far more than 5 hours on my own. Yeah. But I don't always think that way. Yeah. And I'm not trying to confuse it, but I think, that well, that empty well, or that well that we go to that we think is going to offer us, satisfaction, it doesn't. Yeah. And and in that way, we're no different than the Samaritan woman when we have those other wells. And I think at times that can be the beginning of the end as far as relationship, that leads towards that divorce, mm-hmm. when we're dealing with issues of comfort. Mm-hmm. Because I think some of that comes back to, I've just learned to be uncomfortable in this relationship. Yeah. And I think, so often, even as affairs can happen, in my mind, I've said all I can say the only way that I know how to say it, and it still hasn't created this change that I'm looking for.
I've done everything I can, essentially, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and, obviously adding another person into the mix, in other words, an affair or someone, like even if it's not a full-blown affair, someone that's able to provide for you some of the needs that you have, that you're longing for in your marriage. Mm-hmm. That just complicates it to the nth degree, right? Sure. And, dealing with or advising for or against divorce, or however that looks like, becomes almost impossible with that in the picture. Sure. And so it's kind of like, let's not even go there in terms of how to counsel that, or think about that, or or, how to address that. Because I think the number one step there as well, you get that thing out of the picture first, because
Sure.
until it's out of the picture, the clouding will continue.
Yeah.
And the kind of the faux version of reality that you see there is going to
Sure.
continue to tug at you and say, this is what it could be like.
Yeah.
When the reality is, like you said, second divorces look a lot like, or second marriages look a lot like the first one, because I go with it.
Sure.
I go to the next relationship, and if I didn't resolve some of my personal issues in the first one, well, I'm going to be left to resolve them in the second one. Well, or the third one, or,
Yeah.
never, or the fourth one, or,
Yeah.
and like you're saying, ultimately, there are some struggles that we have individually that we're going to bring into every relationship. And until we address those, divorce is going to look like the appealing option, because it's about them, right? It's always another,
The blame.
Yep.
Yeah.
And the other thing too about divorce, I've realized, is that it's very easy for us to do the forgiveness versus permission thing. It's easier to ask for forgiveness than permission. On the other side of that, not being the person getting divorced, but being, it's so easy for me personally to offer grace to those who have been divorced, because it's in the past. It's like, that decision is done. I don't have to think about that, or like advise for that, or none of that. All I need to do is just walk with that person in their current reality and show grace like we're supposed to. So that becomes easy, and I have no problem with that. I don't have any problem with people divorced. We have a lot of friends who are divorced and remarried and all that. And I just see how God's grace is so real in their life just as much as mine, but really it just comes down to someone's in the middle of it, and, in the situations where it's like, feels like divorce is the right option here. It's so hard, and I don't know if this is right, and I don't know if this is wrong, and I don't know where the line is to say, yes, that looks like something that is unhealthy and you need to leave that. It never quite feels right to say that.
Sure.
And I guess I'd love to get your take on that, Mark. And a little context for the listener, which you probably already know, which is Mark and Chris are some of the biggest advocates for marriage that I know. They're doing Marriage on the Rock like every other week, basically. Right now they're in a leading 50-some people or something through this program, right? And you guys do this on a regular basis, and Mark is a marriage and family therapist, and so they are some of the biggest advocates for marriage that I know. And yet I also know that, Mark, you've dealt with a lot of people going through this struggle and working through that. And I want to know, is there a line, Mark, that you found, or is there no line? And it's like, I guess maybe to bury the lead or whatever, you mentioned walking with that person. Can you speak to that? When do you get to that tipping point? Have you gotten to that tipping point? How do you wrestle with that personally?
Those are a bunch of questions.
These are the polarizing, hard stuff.
For me personally, as I'm going to start from the back, the last question towards the front. Where is that? Well, no, the first one was like, where is that line for me? And then the last was kind of the tipping point as far as that goes. For me personally, I believe there is always hope. Okay. And here's where I draw that line, because I'm blessed in some ways by the ability to be a quote unquote professional. Okay. So some of those lines, some of that walking through with people is a line that they choose. Okay. So when a couple basically says, okay, we're going to stop coming for therapy. Okay. That's a line that I have no choice over. And that's okay. It's not preferential, but it is okay with me, because people have recognized, okay, this either to their perspective isn't helpful any longer, or we've made up our mind and we're going in a different direction. And I don't have any control over that. If people want to continue to work with me and they're recognizing that, yes, this is helping and we're open to this and transformation is occurring, then I'm there. I'm in. So does that make sense? Sometimes that line is drawn for me by the individuals I work with.
Yeah.
But if a couple, okay, and here's where it comes back to for me personally, I believe there is always hope, and hope is an anchor, to where there is hope for the individual whose spouse, there is hope. I'm just putting it out there. There is hope for that individual to be able to overcome addiction. Okay. Now, granted, and I think where people get it confused, and from my perspective, is hope just means I'm going to keep doing what I've always done and something is going to change. Okay. That's not always what hope looks like. Hope can sometimes be, no, I'm going to separate from this because it's reactive and it's unhealthy, for my kids. Somebody may get hurt. Okay. Now, when I speak of hurt, I'm talking more often, a physical dynamic of abuse. Okay. And that's not to say that person pulling away and establishing a healthy boundary that says, no, I'm not subjecting myself and I'm not subjecting our children to abuse. Okay. Now, does that mean the person that's being separated from isn't going to experience some hurt? No, it doesn't. They're going to experience a different hurt, but that I'll call it pain, if you will, I believe is part of God's ability to have a disciplinary process. Mm-hmm. You follow me?
Yeah.
So that's to where, from my perspective, personally, I just am that hopeful. There used to be a theory or an operation. It was all hope focused marriage counseling, and I just believe that's where my heart is. That there's hope when I'm willing to recognize that what I do, and it's not about always blaming. Okay. I'm willing to recognize there's some things that I do that contribute to, this dynamic. And I would even say, even in marriage, quite often there are things that spouses do that contribute to, not that it's their fault, but there is this word enabling for a reason. Because sometimes, I recognize you have an addiction and I don't want you getting mad at me. So I'll buy whatever you want to keep you from getting mad at me. You follow me? And it promotes that cycle. So yes, there may be a need where you have to deal with that codependency on your part and say, no, in order for you to get healthy, I need to go step back. I need to get myself healthy in such a way that says, okay, if you get mad, that's okay. And I'm okay with you getting mad. But if you getting mad, if I can't handle, or if I'm overwhelmed or, motivated by the fact that you might get angry, therefore I'm contributing, then I'm culpable. Mm-hmm. You follow me in that? Yeah. In that. So that's kind of, so the fact that there is an opportunity for change, and then yes, if a person, I think there is a point where if a person just continues to choose, their addictive lifestyle, after we've entered into this separation, then yeah, I believe, that becomes problematic. Is that not to say that person, but I have known people, who have basically tried that for years, and it didn't work out. And, they've gone on to marry other people and, but typically once it gets to that point, people quit seeing me.
Yeah. So take off therapist hat,
yep.
Mark, and approach it from a personal dynamic of, I think at some point it does become too close, and we talked about that already, right?
Sure.
But, let's assume it's someone that you know and you love, and they're asking for your counsel on from a personal aspect as your friend, as your whatever.
Right.
And they're not walking away, like,
Yeah.
again, I just want to know, Mark,
You want a line.
where's that line?
Yeah.
Is there a line? Is it just, I guess I have an assumption of what your thoughts are, but
so maybe I need to ask, this, Justin, where is your line?
All right. Here's my thoughts.
Yeah.
So I've had some different situations where we've counseled people struggling in a marriage or whatever.
Uh-huh.
And one of the most recent ones was a guy that I met with for quite a while. And the thing with his situation was there was a lot of stuff in the relationship that were because of his own hurts, habits, and hangups, right?
Sure.
And, he was doing Celebrate Recovery. He was working through this stuff and really came to a place of, victory over these things, to a large degree.
Sure.
To where I looked at him and go, "You're a pretty normal husband now."
Yeah.
It's like, and now you just have the normal flaws.
Sure.
But also
you're
the
still
baggage.
human.
Yeah. But also all the baggage, right?
Sure.
So that came with the previous addictions and stuff, and resulting pains that came with that, and the marriage just kept feeling helpless, like hopeless, probably.
Okay.
Where the wife would only stay with him because she didn't know why, really, and kept saying, "I don't know if I want to be with you," and it just really felt hopeless. And so he would come in, kind of, we would get together, and he would be very despairing often, and I'm like, I don't blame you, man. Oof, that's hard. I said, there might be a day where it's time, but based on this, and this, I don't think today is that day.
Sure.
And it was kind of like that was how the conversation went until we stopped meeting, and it never got to the point where I had to say, where I felt like, yeah, it's pretty clear, and that's kind of where I'm at, is like, I don't know where my line is. I think
where
for
you
me,
had to say what? There never got to a point
where I would advise, yeah, it's probably time. It's the health dynamic has tipped to where, your family, it would all likely be more healthy if you divorced or whatever. And this is one very specific scenario, but I guess that's kind of where I see it, is where it's kind of like kicking the can down the road until you can't anymore.
Sure.
That's kind of my perspective. So is there a line? Not really. I think it's just you just keep kicking until you can't anymore, and then, I don't know. It's like, it's too hard of a question for me.
Yeah.
To give it a line. So that's kind of where I'm at.
Yeah, and that's where I come back to. It's going to come down to an individual dynamic.
Yeah.
Number one, for me personally or professionally, I'm not going to make that choice for someone.
Yeah.
Because and this has happened to me more times than, and I respect.
That's good.
Yeah, it's respect. I respect the fact that I have a passion, but I'm no better at this than any other professional out there. And the reason I say that is because I think sometimes in our professional dynamic, and I've had this happen in my office, a couple who's been married for 15 years, or 20 years, they'll come to me and say, well, we went for counseling 10 years ago, and that therapist at that time told me that I should just go ahead and separate from it. It's like, okay, I'm not necessarily going to make that decision for somebody, let alone tell them that. I believe that's something that they have to wrestle with, or am I willing to walk with them in that and entertain and bring everybody together? Sure. And yet there's that part of me that says, okay, you're back to see someone now, 10 years later. What's going on right now?
Yeah.
what's the circumstantial dynamic that creates this stress, this pressure, this, opportunity to where when we get to this level, we recognize we need help and we start thinking about separating. You follow me? Because realistically, we've had these 10 years and this happens a lot, 5 years, 10 years, it's like, well, how was this possible? That yes, 10 years ago, you were thinking about separating. And then we've had this window because evidently it hasn't been just terrible all along. You follow me? We're at this, we're in this deep, we're in this valley moment now that we're considering, and we're, stress levels are high. So that's kind of where I draw that perspective from. And then that's where I come back to, okay, well, what is it that keeps you in this relationship? What is it about him? What is it about her that attracted you to that person? And I think so often it is about that ability to reshift, from a negative focus to a positive focus. As far as, well, like we talk about here, we can look at the facets of an individual and label them, okay, based on those negative facets, if you will, or those what we do here, the similar facets. And so therefore they are blank. But yet there's so many other facets of an individual that we either choose not to see or that are very similar to us, and therefore they don't matter as much. Mm-hmm. And so I think, in that process, so coming back to your question about the line, I think for me, there isn't a specific line. There's a general line that is able to identify, okay, healthy boundaries. Like, and granted, boundaries are fuzzy lines.
Yeah. Yeah.
You follow me?
Yeah.
Because, so yeah, there is a crossing over, and my spouse kind of gets to define that. But what looks like crossing a line for you in your relationship is going to be different than somebody else in their relationship. And, and so often as you were talking about that couple, and here again, I don't know either individual. I just want to put that out there. But I think so often, in that process of transformation, resentment comes into play.
Yeah.
Where, I've dealt with this so long, or, this has been going on for 12 years, and now you've become a good husband. Yeah. And now what am I supposed to do with that? Why couldn't you have done this 5 years ago? Yeah. That kind of thing. And here again, I don't know these people, but, I can understand how that kind of resentment can come into play. And yet I also recognize, depending on a spiritual relationship with God, I can overcome that resentment.
Yeah. There's even resentment can surface once you see someone start to heal and move
quite
forward.
Often.
Yeah, because it's like, wait a second, you're saying I could have had this my whole life?
Yes. Where was this 5 years ago?
Yeah. And so then it can just be, that can be the shocking pull you out of denial on the other side, to be able to, like, well, crap, it really was bad. And now all of the anger that was suppressed through coping mechanisms is starting to seep out everywhere. And the other spouse is left going, but I'm better. Yeah. I'm doing the good stuff.
Yeah.
And it's like,
well, why bother? At that point, that person says, why bother?
Yeah.
And we can see how those cycles can be created. Yeah. And the interest, here's the other part of that. It's, there is this dynamic called homeostasis, to where when I do change, quite often my system resists me out of a desire to maintain homeostasis, maintain status quo. Yeah. And so, yes, what you're describing is part of systems, to where, the system will fight
And the system
against
needs to
healthy
be
change.
reset, right? Like
Yes.
that equilibrium needs to shift, the homeostasis needs to shift.
Yes.
But that's that's hard.
Yes.
Yeah.
And
Or
that's
it's-
where both people have to actually relearn
Yeah.
some of these cycle dynamics that have but have been established over time.
Yeah.
And you do this and I do this. So when I'm trying to relearn,
Yes.
you have to relearn at the same time.
Yeah, it's so hard. And
Yeah.
the physics term that comes to mind is inertia, right? Like when
sure.
something starts spinning and you try and stop the
Hmm.
thing that started it, it's like, but the inertia keeps the movement going and you're fighting that,
Sure.
And so, you may have stopped the behavior that was spinning the top, but the top keeps spinning. And it's like, wait a second, but I'm not doing it anymore. Yeah, there's inertia there. That's that homeostasis you're talking about where the system's already set in place. And
Yep.
it takes a long time for a top to stop, right?
Sure.
Like,
And that's where I'll run into it, with people. It's like, okay, it's been years that we've been living with this cycle dynamic and we just want it fixed now.
Yeah.
So it should only take like 5 sessions and we can, it's like, no, we're not going to, it's been 5 years to establish this. We're not going to stop it in 5 minutes type
Yeah.
stuff. And I think that can be it's expectation. So I guess that's as I think about our topic of divorce, I know we've kind of made it about boundaries, but I want to offer that hope to
Yeah.
people. And as I think about that, I can think what it comes back to me, and I guess part of my passion is when I think about it, divorce tends to be very isolating. And what I enjoy about the group dynamics, well, even CR, but what I enjoy about the group dynamic of, the classes we do, it's like I'm able to sit in that room with other people and hear, oh my goodness, you deal with that too? You experience that in your relationship too? And from my perspective, divorce, is that dynamic that leads to isolation, where in some ways, I can't talk with you, in a relationship dynamic. So I may talk with a few other people. Some of those people may just be encouraging me to separate, and I don't necessarily have people who are giving me that advice that would basically say, well, help me understand how you're contributing to this,
Yeah.
and
yet-
really challenging that. And I think support is really helpful. Healthy support
Yes.
is
Yeah.
very helpful in avoiding some of those pitfalls that lead to divorce.
Yeah.
And yet I think a lot of people, I admire people who are able to say, yeah, I want to get it right this time. Because I've experienced that hurt. And I see how it's affected, my spouse. I see how it's affecting our children, and I want to get it right this time. And I just admire people who are able to say, okay, yeah, that's what I did. And that's how I contributed. And I want to change that in me, because I realize if I could have dealt with that maybe a while back, it could have changed things for us.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean it. You had the thought there in that process.
No, I can't help but keep thinking about that person who, there's always hope, right? I agree with you on that. But there's also that person who's just dead tired. And
Yep.
due to the dysfunction in their relationship,
Yep.
they are wiped out. And you say, all you have to do is get back up and run a mile. It's
I hear ya.
No, you don't understand.
No, I gotcha.
And I just have, my mind keeps coming back to that. And I guess just, I just feel that compassion for that person is like, it's going to be work. It's going to be hard. You're going to have to learn some new skills. You're going to, basically you have to go to boot camp, and it's like, I just feel like I got done running a marathon with a broken leg in the rain, just beat up, beat down. And when you say more work, it makes me want to just give up.
Yeah.
you know? And that's the part that's so hard. Yeah, I mean, I don't know how you, but I also believe there's always hope, and I believe that the Holy Spirit can infuse them with what they need, and I believe that we, people around them, can be the ones to help them to stand up and kind of put our arm around their shoulder, help them limp across the finish line, right?
Sure.
Like, I believe that there's opportunities there, but I just want to recognize that it's not as simple as, well, you just got to do some work and you got to do some changes, and part of this is your fault. And
I agree.
Yeah.
And I appreciate what you share, because I want to recognize there's a tremendous difference between hope and optimism, hope and expectation.
Yeah.
You follow me? And I apologize. The part that's coming to mind is it wasn't 7 Habits. I think it was it 7. No, it's the red. I can picture the book. It's got a red cover on it. Highly of successful people.
7 Habits of Highly Effective People.
No, that's Stephen Covey.
Yeah. What's the
Collins is his name.
Oh.
Either way, it was one of those business books.
Yeah, the bus one.
Nope, not the bus one. But either way, it talked about, and this is what it's yeah.
The Collins book that's red, guys.
Yeah, that one. He talks about a POW camp, and the individual in the camp, the kind of the leader that survived that camp, basically said, forget about optimism. He says, because here's what happens. He says, when you have the idea, you can maintain optimism for about so long. But when Christmas comes, if your hope was that when Christmas comes, we'll be out, he said, at that point, when Christmas comes, you will be defeated, and therefore you will die.
Yeah. Your optimism swings to the other side.
Yes, because I missed my expectation was that it would happen by here. You follow me? Or, and I apologize because it's so vivid in my mind.
Good to Great?
Yes. Who wrote Good to Great?
Well, I think Collins, because that's what.
Yes, it's Good to Great.
I'll look it up.
It's Good to Great. Yes, thank you. I appreciate that. Now there's other people that
You're
aren't.
welcome, Linda.
But yes, Good to Great in that process, and it's in that book, and like you say, I know it's highlighted in my
Definitely
copy.
Read.
Yeah. I'm visual. That's what But
Jim Collins.
Yes, thank you.
Well done. Between the two of us, we know that book. I don't think I've read it, but I remember when the church staff was.
I will send that to you to be able to put it in if you would like to as a link, a page and copy type thing.
Cool.
But it was just really good, and I think so often we can get hope mixed up with optimism. And when those times come, it's easy to lose my optimism, and then I become bitter.
Yeah. I think for me, I just want to convey some compassion there. It's the main thing to just.
I agree with you.
If this is your struggle, man, I feel you, and I don't. It's just I have no desire to just say, well, you just gotta.
And I by all means I agree with you.
Yeah.
This is not a polarizing issue where we're concerned.
Yeah.
Because I want to
agree.
recognize, it's not getting up and running a mile. And sometimes even just the next step can seem like a marathon.
Yeah.
I think about it very similar to how we've talked about depression. Because you're just telling me to move on and just do this, and everything will change. And yet you don't understand.
Yeah.
And I think that's where it comes back to that ability to say, okay, I respect that's where you are. And I'm willing to be your friend right here, right now, in the midst of this.
Yep. Yeah. And, back to this specific person in this specific struggle too, that's one of the primary tools in recovery for how do I get through today? Like, how do I get through this current wave of desire, craving, like to not go back to that substance or that
Sure.
solution. And we always say it's one day at a time, one moment at a time, right? And
10 minutes at a time.
exactly. So if that
Yeah.
means, stay there on the ground, take another breath,
Sure.
just get through this moment. We're
Yeah.
not asking you to get up right now,
Yeah.
but as well as anyone else out here, like eventually you got to get up
Yeah.
one way or another. But right now, take that get through this moment.
Yeah.
And I think hope is better when the future is left in the hands of a higher power
Sure.
and we take on the present moment. And that's where the hope lives. The Bible says we have enough grace just for today.
Sure.
He's given us a very specific dose for today.
Sure.
And sometimes we borrow, we attempt to take from tomorrow's dose, or we attempt to use today's dose to work through tomorrow's problems. And guess what? The ration doesn't quite hold up in that scenario.
Sure.
Right? And I think that's the thing when they're in that situation. Because even if you're heading towards divorce, even if that's the quote unquote solution to the issue, you're not going to make that decision this minute.
Yeah.
Most often, right? Like,
Right.
is you got to, obviously there's always a moment where then that
Sometimes,
decision,
when we entertain that option,
Yeah.
we start thinking that way. But
Yeah.
yes, I'm hearing where you're coming from.
Yeah, I guess I'm just saying it is about the moments. It is, especially in traumatic situations, or in the case of recovery and addiction, and in those those moments that are pulling at you so hard.
Yeah.
Can you get through this minute?
Right.
To then report on it. Okay,
Sure.
you did it. Can you
Yeah.
get through the next minute? Can you get, like you said, the next 10 minutes? Can we get to the end of the day?
Sure.
And that's what that's about when you're just exhausted. You have nothing else, to do but can you sit there?
Yeah.
Can you rest? Can you get up and walk a few steps and sit back down? That would be my, I guess, take on someone who's in that position is like, well, let's rest a little bit first before we
Yeah.
run the marathon out of this. Whichever direction you go, it's going to be a marathon. Like, that's the other thing to understand about divorce is often it's perceived as the easy way out. And you can interview literally anybody who's been divorced, and they will tell you that was not an easy way out.
Yeah. I hear you.
Because it's hard. And
Yeah. And as you're sharing, like you say, I want to offer compassion. And I think at times, so often the individual that is just exhausted has found themselves in the process of doing it all. You follow me in that? They are exhausted. And my first thing to them would be, okay, step back a little bit. You don't have to do it all. If you're doing it all in this relationship, you have to pull back even in some ways just to make room for someone else to help. You have to make a vacuum in some ways for that other individual to step in. And until you do, they're not going to. There's no need. So I'm with you in that process of being able to say, yeah, it's okay to pull back. So yeah, I appreciate you bringing up the topic this morning, Justin. And like you say, I don't necessarily feel that we dealt well with just that topic of divorce, but I appreciate the ability to talk about it in a polarizing way that hopefully offers encouragement for, couples who are wrestling. And I also hope that basically we've been able to convey a compassion for people who have experienced divorce and the ability to say, okay, going forward, what does it look like for me to be a healthy individual in the next time? Yeah.
Yeah. I think compassion, like you said, and understanding that, man, I wish that they didn't have to come out on the other side and then deal with not only the struggles of a new life, but also defending that choice. And it's like, but that's why it's a personal choice. Like you said, ultimately it's going to come down to your individual choice and the reality of, what you're going to have to live with after that, whatever that looks like, right?
Sure.
Including the did I do the wrong thing and defending it and all that. It's like, but at the same time, there's no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. And
Yes.
let's move forward and use what's behind us to propel us forward. And, and that's pretty much how I see it. So.
And that's how I see it.
Hey, thank you for listening to our podcast. If you like how I see it, please do all the things that podcasts tell you to do. Subscribe, rate, review, follow us, and or talk nicely about us on social media. If you want to reach out, the email is us@howiseeit.click. Yep, I said .click, as in .click. Please tell your friends about this show, and we'll see you on the next one.